Tonight, it's a pleasure to welcome Joseph Kanon to talk about his new thriller, Shanghai, his 11th book. Before his writing career, Joe was editor-in-chief, CEO, and president of the publishing houses E.P. Dutton and Houghton Mifflin. After his first novel, Los Alamos, published in 1997, became a bestseller and received the Edgar Award for Best First Novel in 1998, Joe left the world of acquiring books for creating them. Further novels followed, including The Prodigal Spy, The Good German, made into a movie with Cate Blanchett and George Clooney, Alibi, Stardust, and Istanbul Passage among them. Stories set in the period between World War II and 1950, using real events are background for historical thrillers. Shanghai is no exception. Set in 1939, Chinese, Japanese, Russians, British, French are competing for money and power in the city. Added to the mix, 20,000 European Jews with all their assets and passports confiscated by the Nazis after Kristallnacht, arrived stateless in a tumultuous, nearly lawless city notorious for vice. Shanghai became a haven for Iraqi Jews 100 years earlier, after the British won the First Opium War, and a trading concession. Starting in the 1840s, Iraqi Jews who'd made fortunes in India increased them in Shanghai. By the 1930s, Victor Sassoon, an Englishman of Iraqi Jewish origins who had made his fortune in opium and arms trade, built the Hotel Cathay and financed the famous nightclub Ciro's. My grandparents, along with my mother, visited Shanghai for 2 nights at the Cathay Hotel in April 1939, 2 years before the events in Shanghai, and 7 months before the Japanese took over the city in what is considered the first battle of World War II. The Japanese Nanking massacre happened a month later. Ignoring or unaware of the looming Japanese threat or the city's seamier sides, Granny wrote in her journal, "Stopped in at Ciro's for a drink and a dance." American orchestra, very modern, large nightclub. You felt as if you were at home, much like the Central Park Casino or the Iridium Room. Sorry after we were not in evening clothes, bed at 2:30 a.m. Shanghai may have been a city of vice, but it was also an international, glitzy, sophisticated destination. Joe visited Shanghai just before COVID set in. I can only imagine how important libraries and open stacks became for him in the writing of this book. In Shanghai, he has illuminated an astonishing and unique time and place in World War II history that now will never be forgotten thanks to this page-turning thriller of a story. From Alan First, the perfect combination of intrigue and accurate history brought to life. From Scott Turow, sensational. No one writes period fiction with the same style and suspense, not to mention substance. A terrific read. Shanghai is as good as crime fiction gets. Please welcome Joe Kanon.
Well, I'm going to have Jenny write all my reviews from now on. You really get it, so that's fine. Is this loud enough? Can you hear? Then we won't have to ask that again. Okay. To ask a writer to talk about his book is always catnip to the writer. We'd like nothing better. But this is particularly nice for me because some of the book was actually written in this building. Even more of it was researched in the building with the wonderful open stacks. And perhaps most importantly, there were several restorative naps that took place in this very room. And I'm grateful for the easy chairs, and I hope you never cash them in for new ones. They're just perfect as they are. When you do these sort of book events, the question that invariably comes up, usually first as a matter of fact, is where did you get the idea? why this book? Why did you write this book? And usually it's code for, is it autobiographical? Is the girl on the boat your wife? I can tell you, by the way, that I wish I had known about your mother earlier. I would have put her in. I think this stems from this, mistaken notion that we have that novels are some other forms of journals or diaries. I think they're not. I think there's a different kind of construction altogether. But the question itself, given how many ideas there are and how many writers there are, seems as something that's almost impossible to answer. Where did you get the idea? It turns out that in this one instance, I'm lucky, because almost always, in fact, for almost each one of the books, it began, the process, the building block process was similar, and it began with a place. What happens is that I will go somewhere, I will become fascinated, I will want to know more about it, and the more I know about it, the closer it comes to suggesting characters, and then they in turn suggest the story that unfolds. Shanghai was a classic example of this happening. It was, as Jenny pointed out, right before COVID. I was there in Shanghai as a tourist. I don't know how many of you have had a similar experience. It's certainly a popular tourist destination. And you probably did what I did. You walked along the Bund and you saw the grand old insurance buildings and trading offices of the Europeans along the riverfront. You looked across at Pudong, which seems to be a brand new Hong Kong that's gone up in 5 years, and so you admired all the infrastructure, and you had the soup dumplings, and you probably went to a chic restaurant in the French concession, which still is the prettiest part of the city, etc. I did all those things, as I assumed that any of you who had been there would have done, and then there was something else. Something caught my eye in a guidebook as a kind of minor site, but I thought, really? And this was about buildings that were being restored and preserved in Hongqiu, the neighborhood that had hosted Jewish refugees before World War II. And I thought, really? I've never heard of this. I mean, who knew? I mean, are we talking about 4 people, 5 people, what? It turns out we were talking about 20,000 people. And I thought this might be worth a look in just to see, because it seemed so intriguing to me. So it's not a bad walk from central Shanghai, by the way. So we walked to Hongqiu. The building that had been the synagogue is now a museum filled with really interesting photographs of people there at the time. There's a kind of restored coffee house which is meant to suggest to you what it was like when Chusan Road was called Little Vienna, and you had all the signs in either Hebrew or German, people buying pastries, Viennese dentists, and yet all these rickshaws in the street. It was this scene of, I thought, absolutely fascinating cultural collision. I thought, what do they make of each other? What's this like for them? What's going on? Why Shanghai? And the more I looked into it, the more I was convinced there was something to write about. The first answer was very simple to why Shanghai, is because there was nowhere else. After November 1938, when the Nazis launched that horrifying pogrom, which we now call Kristallnacht, Jews in Germany realized that it was no longer just going to be a discriminatory regime. We were talking about saving one's skin, saving one's life. And the lines began to form at consular offices all over Berlin to get out. Now it was really a desperate time. But this is happening just at the time when all of the doors of the world are being closed to them. There are no visas available. The waiting list for America alone is something like 3 years, if not more. There is nowhere to go, and there is no one who will have them, even for money, for ready money. And then a rumor sweeps through Berlin and Vienna, places that were affected, a rumor that if you applied in Shanghai, you didn't need a landing permit, you didn't need an exit visa or an entry visa, you can just get off the boat and start a new life. This caused an immediate surge of people to the Lloyd Triestino shipping lines. That was the German shipping line that went to the Orient. And if you could afford it, if you could afford passage, and you were prepared to give up all of your assets, but all of them, no matter where they might be, and your state citizenship, your passports, your language, etc., you could go, and you could save yourself. And so they did. Shanghai is the story of two people, essentially. I mean, there are several more, but the love couple, let's call them, because something happens on the boat, as should happen, I think, in most novels that are not necessarily autobiographical. And our hero, or our protagonist, Daniel, has been bailed out by an uncle in Asia with passage money to get out. And he is, having been a member of the resistance, he is getting out by the skin of his teeth. Everyone else in his gang has been captured and tortured and killed, and he is luckily escaping by this route. For him, going to Shanghai is to start another life, to get a second chance, and to really save himself. On the boat, he meets Leia, a woman who is also starting afresh, but who has a much grimmer view of what's ahead for them, who understands the reality of a new life for her, having been savaged by the Nazis in Vienna. They have an affair which is much more like, let's do it while we can, because there are only a few weeks left before we head into this other life, which is really going to be a horror in so many ways. We have the story of what happens to them, but we still go back, just for a minute, to why Shanghai? I mean, it wasn't that people were so much more warm-hearted or generous there. Quite the contrary, I would imagine. But it became this great political anomaly, a sort of loophole. And what had happened, and I'm not here to give a history lesson, but I can do this in about a minute and a half, and any of you who already know it can just zone out for a while, and then it'll be restorative. About 100 years before the events of this book, in 1842, in fact, we had the following situation, where Britain was buying all the tea in China, and a lot of the silk and the porcelain and everything else. The problem was that nobody was buying anything from Britain. So in this classic balance of payments issue, they came up with a very clever idea of selling a product that China would want or could be made to want, which was opium, and formed the triangle from the Afghanistan poppy fields through India, which they then controlled, into China, which was considered their ready market. The Qing dynasty, teetering on its last legs, said, no, we don't want our people enslaved. We know what this drug is. We know what it can do. So a war was fought, the so-called Opium Wars, at the end of which a treaty was made that allowed Westerners to trade in China. It opened up China to the foreign merchants and granted them land on which to operate. This meant that they weren't supposed to go anywhere else. They were supposed to be contained in these concessions. But it meant that they would have, if not national sovereignty, they would have control over them, political control. They then became this oddball arrangement. They weren't colonies. They weren't foreign countries. They were just what Shanghai was, an anomaly, this big loophole. 20,000 Europeans found the loophole and wriggled through it. They arrive, and what did they find? I thought, let's go to the next question. All right, Shanghai was the destination because nowhere else would take me. No one else would allow this immigration to happen. Okay, but still, what was it like when people arrived? There were wonderful photographs of the muddy riverfront with its rickety piers that were stuck out into the water. And you can imagine what it's like to get off the boat yourself and be confronted by this city, which by 1939 has become the 5th largest city in the world, having started as a just little fishing village when the Opium Wars broke out. There are the wonderful buildings that will remind me, of Europe, and they still do, they're still there, and Art Deco hotels, the Cathay Hotel, indeed, built by Sir Victor Sassoon. They would then see the department stores, the Western buildings, and they would think that they were back in Europe, except for the coolies, the rickshaws, the fact that there was no there were no alphabets. Things were done in ideograms. It was totally foreign and exotic. To travel there took 2 weeks, sometimes 3, and you were literally on the other side of the world. You might as well have been on the moon. The photographs of the new arrivals have an even eerier cast to them because for most of these people who did not have relatives, as our hero does, but most of them are dependent now on the charity of people who were already in Shanghai and setting up some sort of rescue mission for them. And you see photographs of people being loaded onto the backs, the flatbeds of trucks, and they look eerily reminiscent of photographs of the Holocaust as people are being run out. They are taken to the Heime, the dormitories that had been set up by the charitable organizations, just to keep people off the streets so that they'd have some place to live until they could get on their feet, most of whom did, by the way. As they went off, what they thought was, how am I going to make a living here? We're desperate to survive. They have come halfway around the world only to be confronted by a city whose gap between rich and poor is horrific to European eyes. People who are starving sometimes. The general council, the city council in Shanghai, every 2 days, I think it was, had somebody go around at night to collect the bodies of people who had died in the street overnight because they were starving. On the other hand, you had this capital of vice, and what they not lucked into, but what they landed into was a city as notorious as Chicago in the 20s or Weimar, Berlin. It was any kind of advice was available, and yours for the having. If you were a soldier right off the ship and you had some money in your pocket and you wanted a brothel and a dive bar, Shanghai had it. If you were a trader at Jardine and Matheson and you wanted a different kind of brothel, a sort of high-end one, and a gambling den, and maybe even a pipe of opium, Shanghai could supply that too. There was a club for everybody. You could go to Ciro's on Bubbling Wells Road and think that you were in a Hollywood movie, and you were because it had been copied from a Hollywood movie. You could dance at the Cathay Hotel, where Sir Victor Sassoon had in fact put a polished floor down just like in the Fred Astaire movies, so you could feel that you were Fred and Ginger for a while. Or you can go out to the Canodrome, to the racetrack, the dog track, where the Manila Rhythm Boys were often playing, and sometimes bands from Harlem would come through. Joe Fenner, who was the Ziegfeld of Shanghai, would put on floor shows that would include his Paramount Peaches, chorus lines of 20 to 30 girls who were the envy of New York. This was all there. It was all there for the taking, and hundreds of them. And it so happened that our characters arrive, I mean, it's a very short window when all this is taking place, because if we begin in November 38, it fundamentally ends in September 39 when the war starts because the boats stop running. So one way or another, there was going to be closure to this. But if you were one of the people who arrived during that period, you also happened to arrive at a time when the vice industry, the nightclub industry, was accelerating and growing and becoming even more vibrant than it was before. The reason for this is that the Western limits of Shanghai had always been fuzzily kind of surveyed and mapped, and nobody particularly cared because they all wanted to live near the river where the trade was, and so nobody was out in the country. But as the city filled up, people did begin to care, and it looked to be that a lot of this land belonged technically to the Chinese, which meant to the conquering Japanese who had just in 37 invaded them in that horrifying war. They wanted their bite of the apple. They wanted the kind of bribes and loose money and all of the, I was about to say fun, and I didn't mean to say fun. The fun that the customers had, but someone else didn't. Anyway, the Japanese wanted their piece of this. So they encouraged the building of more casinos and more opium dens, etc., and became part of the managers of the nightlife there. It wasn't just the Chinese gangs anymore who used to control Shanghai. The Japanese had taken those over. You would think, given everything, and given the situation, I mean, you understand the Japanese had come literally to the street barrier between the Chinese city and, let's say, the French concession. What had happened is that the British and the Americans and about 9 other countries had come together to form the international settlement. The French kept their own concession separate. You could escape any kind of legal ramification simply by walking across the street. And the Japanese would come up to this point and go no further. They didn't want to take on the British Empire at this point, and they didn't want to fight the Americans. They were not going to mess with this international community, which was in any case suiting them. It suited them for the money to keep flowing in the same way. So we get that phrase, dancing on the rim of the volcano, where people who ought to have known better, and certainly we know better in retrospect, but maybe they didn't, just carry on. The money is going to go on forever. We are here because it's so worth our while to be here. It's all going to be fine. It's been fine up until now, and it'll stay that way. And so they grow and they grow. And as the vice industry grows, what begins to happen is that the whole city becomes a gangster city. We have a real violence problem. There are drive-by shootings, there are assassinations, there are people on running boards. It's everything that's out of a Jimmy Cagney movie. And yet, in Shanghai, we had yet another layer that's put onto this violence. I mean, so far in the building blocks for this book, we have a group of people desperate to survive and save their lives. A city whose glamour is exceeded only by its squalor at the same time. And now we have the third building block, which is that the unique nature of Shanghai's political violence. It is often said that crime and politics are just two flip sides of the same coin. But nowhere was this more true than in Shanghai. The classic example for this is that when Chiang Kai-shek was still in Shanghai in the late 20s, before he was in exile, fighting Mao in his civil war, he went to Big-eared Du, who was the leader of the, not a made-up name, by the way, who was leader of the Green Gang, and said, "You run the opium business in Shanghai, and I'm going to let you continue doing it, but you're going to take care of the communists for me. We need that. That's the tit for tat." Big-eared Du went off and killed as many, it is estimated, as 10,000 people, thus eviscerating the Communist Party in Shanghai for many years to come. For that sort of thing to happen was extraordinary, and in any time and place, but it was doubly so in Shanghai, where you had all of these conflicting sources. So what I wanted, instead of a journal or a diary in this book, was to take these building blocks and create desperate people, a glamorous but squalid setting, and the political violence which is going to test everyone, because where do you take a stand? Where does it end? I felt that if those were put together, they would form the platform or a stool for the novel, in which it's really a moral minefield. Because I do think that, if not a journal, that what novels are, or can be, or should be, are agents of moral inquiry. What do you do to save yourself? How far will you go? What line will you cross? What line is not worth crossing? What can you do about history that will not let you alone? You can turn your back on it, but it's not finished with you. Is murder acceptable? Is it ever tolerable for political or even personal reasons? These are all questions that the characters in this novel are being asked, and the decisions they make, the choices they make, are really the story that's supposedly unfolding. I wanted to take the story of people who found refuge in a desperate situation, but who had to pay a very high cost for it. And the cost is in the drama of the story, which I will not spoil for you by going on. I would just say this. I don't mean to suggest that this is a heavy moral treatise and that we are in any way talking about the brothers Karamazov. That's not the case. I want it to be entertaining, and I hope that you will be entertained by it. Or as somebody once said to me, the love story alone. So I said, fine. But I think there are these questions, and I think they need to be asked in books that we have any respect for. I don't know that books can particularly answer them. I think what they should be doing, however, is to keep asking them, because the minute we stop asking these questions, we're going to stop being the sort of people we want to be. On which note, I should actually end it on a higher note, but the love story is really good. I would try that. But can I ask, are there any questions? We could talk about what you would like to talk about. Yeah.
This is sort of the nonfiction part of it, but this whole area got preserved and pointed out its jurisdiction because it was neglected, or did they really make an effort to keep it in place?
I think, it had been neglected over the years, but I think it was, the idea was that it would make a tourist attraction, which indeed it has for Westerners, particularly who, I just had not heard the story. I mean, many people, I guess, must have known. There were certainly enough people there. And what happened to them after the wars is interesting because practically nobody stayed. And after the communists took over in 1949, and it was made clear that foreigners were not welcome, they couldn't stay. But most of them eventually got to where they had been aiming for in the beginning, which was America or Australia or Britain or even South America. And they survived the war. It was there, there's an even greater irony, I think, in that the Americans and the British become enemy aliens. I mean, after Pearl Harbor, they become the enemy. But the refugee Jews, by virtue of having no passport at all, are never the enemy aliens, and they are not put in the same sort of camps that the Americans and the British were. The neighborhood where they primarily lived was in fact made into a ghetto situation where you had to have papers to get in and out if you were going to work. But it was not like Warsaw. It wasn't a waiting stop for a death camp, and these people were not subjected. I mean, they didn't have a great time, but they were not subjected to what you can see. And there's an interesting movie called Empire of the Sun, which is about a British kid who survives this and is taken to one of these internment camps. That was a harder situation than our people faced, the people in this book. Yeah.
In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, a lot of white Russians went to Shanghai, and there was a sort of a second Russian red and white civil war in Shanghai in the 20s and 30s, if I'm remembering correctly. And does that show up in your book? I mean, you mentioned the Russians.
Yes.
Is that still going on, the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks going?
Irina was, in the book, is a white Russian. What happened is, yes, there were Russian refugees who actually, most of them ended in Harbin in Manchuria, and then some to Shanghai. What became famous about them is that somehow, for one reason or another, the men in general could not find their footing. And they were usually hired as bouncers and doormen at many of these nightclubs that we're talking about. You would often get Ivan, who was the great bouncer. And unfortunately, the reputation is that so many of the women became prostitutes. But we're not talking, I mean, the numbers are not as significant as 20,000. Yes.
Given your building blocks, did you have a hard time making the characters? I've read it, I pre-ordered it, so I'm thinking about the strength of the characters, the background is so rich. When did you reach a point where you could make a balance between the characters and your building blocks?
The building blocks are what the characters dance on. I mean, all of your focus should be on the characters. I think all writing that has any pretension to seriousness is about character and about who we are to each other. I mean, I think, you know, you want a mystery novel. The mystery novel is who are other people? Not just who is yourself, but who are they all? And I think that the exploration of character is absolutely the great gift of the novel as a form and what we should pay a lot of respect to. So, I mean, I'm not saying I did that. I can only hope that I certainly was trying to do it. So I hope that it worked. Yeah.
Did you find letters or diaries written by those Jews who were there? They wound up in Latin America or whatever they wound up. But in other words, did you find a lot of material in that kind of research?
Some. I mean, it depends what we want to call a lot. There have been a few memoirs of people who were children at the time, usually. And I don't mean to suggest that I was in archives and delving down in sort of dusty places and coming across original letters. First of all, I couldn't read the language, so there wouldn't be a lot of point. But they did, in fact, write memoirs, some of which were translated. I mean, the interesting thing is that because so much of this falls under the rubric of Holocaust studies, there was perhaps a greater chance of them being translated than otherwise. And there are still some survivors. They are now, given the chronology of this, they were young children at the time. But at one of these events, somebody said to me, "Oh, and your research, were you in Shanghai during the war?" And I I mean, I know we're not as young as we used to. Yes.
As someone who actually had extended family member who was in Shanghai and escaped that way from Vienna, I was wondering if you had a chance to talk to any of the survivors and what their what they were telling you and kind of how they were looking back and thinking about that period and the fact that people are remembering and really trying to make an effort now to preserve that history in Shanghai.
The answer to that is that I did meet some of them, but only after I had finished the book. And it wasn't deliberate on my part. It's just that there was an event in which they had brought some survivors together. And so you got a chance socially to chat with them. But, they were children. So there wasn't a lot that they could really, at the time, that they could tell you. I find this whole business of personal testimony and witnessing is really tricky. It's a kind of slippery slope because, for instance, in my first book in Los Alamos, set during the making of the atomic bomb, I discovered after I'd finished the book that in fact I knew I had a contact who could have put me in touch with one of the scientists who was working on the project. And you think, drat, that would have been so valuable and he'd given me such wonderful details. And then I thought, actually, it's just as well. I think that one of the things that's hard for us to understand is that someone who was there has the authority of having been there, but may not absolutely remember perfectly. If we talk about this evening 3 weeks from now, you're going to have very different versions of how it all went. And I think 40, 50 years that go by have an even greater effect. What's most valuable, I find, in doing that sort of research is stuff written at the time, letters, journals, the non-novels, right? And even journalism. It's fascinating to see what often isn't said so that you could get the kind of assumptions that they're making. Yes?
Does the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. have materials that document Shanghai?
I don't know. I assume. I mean, I should have gone there. You can't please everybody. I thought going to Shanghai was work enough. It's like go to DC too. No, I don't know, but certainly there is memorabilia that could be put in such a situation. I mean, it's a really interesting story, and not as well known as it might be. There was recently at the Philharmonic, someone has done a musical piece, an oratorio based on this event. And which is where I encountered some of the people who had actually lived in Shanghai at the time because they were invited as guests. And so I was fascinated to see what they had to say. But aside from that, most people have not heard about this. Now, from my point of view, that was lucky because you don't want to go over the same material over and over and you'd like something fresh. But it's also a story that you think really ought to be known. And so, you know, if in some small way I get it placed there on the spectrum, that would be great. Yes.
Your novels have been set in various exotic and interesting places, Russia, Turkey. Do you spend a lot of time at those places, or is it there you get the idea and then let it ruminate?
I like to use it as an excuse to spend more time there. And Shanghai, in fact, is probably the least because COVID broke out and then I couldn't go back. And I just went on with the book. And so I did a lot of research from the stacks and from printed material, etc. But Istanbul, for instance, I think I went 5 times and it was always with the excuse that, oh, I'm researching and I have to do this. In fact, it's because I love the city and I think it's great. And I do believe that one of the valuable things, I call it setting the scene, you know, figuring out where people are, where did he live? Where was the apartment? If you could afford to live anywhere, where would you have lived in those days? Did you take a tram? Could you walk to work? I mean, all of that stuff, which I think is the bread and butter of scene making. The reader doesn't have to know all those details, but the writer has to know them because if you've got somebody walking down the street, you should be seeing exactly what your character is seeing. I mean, you can't ever. It's very hard to do. But the more you do, the better it is, I think. So I do a lot of traveling to these places. I haven't done as much to Shanghai as I would have liked. I've been to Berlin very often because I think it's a fascinating place. And et cetera, et cetera. It's also, there's a magical thinking aspect to this of writing where I don't know why some things appeal and some things don't. I mean, I've never written a novel about Paris. I love Paris, but everybody else has written about it. I mean, there are just some things that attract you and some that don't. Yeah.
So did you say that when Mao overran Shanghai? So all these concessions just evaporated?
Yeah.
And there was a mass exodus of.
Well, if you could, yeah. Yeah. But all during this period, I mean, from 45 on, there were attempts to leave. I mean, partly because nobody had ever wanted to go there in the first place as their family destination. Not that there was anything wrong, you know, this is not a diss on Shanghai. It's just they had lives elsewhere. And particularly after 48, Israel became a great draw for people who were going to emigrate out of there. But in 49, when Mao came in, nobody stayed. You had to go somewhere else.
But are these concessions still definitive of the?
No, Mao just declared them illegal. And
they raised them?
And just said, no mas. You know, the one additional thing that I neglected to say earlier about these concessions that's so, I mean, they were deeply resented by the Chinese and certainly by Mao, because one of the clauses, not only were they granted this piece of land, but they were granted something called extraterritoriality, which they pronounced as extrality. And what this meant was that you could only be tried by the courts of your native country. And therefore, the Chinese had absolutely no legal sway over them whatsoever. It also meant that fundamentally nobody was tried because it was just too difficult. You know, this is part of that whole loophole thinking. You had a municipal council who had a police force and people to clean the streets, etc. But you didn't have a State Department issuing visas, and you didn't have all the trappings of a foreign country. And consequently, by being nothing, they became a great haven. Were you jumping up to stop me?
Not at all, that's okay.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Do you have a sense what sort of journalism or reporting was available to the exiles in Shanghai? Did the Jewish people who had left Vienna know what was going on in Vienna after they left?
That's an interesting question. It's people in Vienna didn't really know what was going on in Vienna. So no, but it's important that we
Yes.
get that, because what would be available to these refugees were German language papers. And German language papers, which existed in Shanghai. I think there were even 2 or 3, it wasn't just one. But they would be run by Nazis. So the kind of information you were getting was misinformation to the nth power. It was hard, and afterwards not easy either. But we ourselves were not getting great information at that time. Although, you know, there's that whole romance of the foreign correspondent, and it certainly was true in China. They would travel all over, and the exoticism of it would be part of the appeal. Anyone? Yep.
What's your opinion of the way they rebuilt the French concession fund?
Oh, it's true. I mean,
20 years in the last.
I mean,
20
it's quite wonderful. I mean, the one thing is that they, in 49, when Mao came in, he could have destroyed the Bund as an example of the hated foreign imperialists, but in fact, he preserved it, which has only made it a great tourist attraction because it, you know, it's these big European buildings and Art Deco palaces, etc. The French concession itself is pretty. I mean, it's, you know, if you can afford it, it's the most desirable part of the city to live. It's very near the center, and it's got, you know, avenues of plane trees and good restaurants and all those things we associate with France. Yeah.
You do such incredible research, and then you get all asked all these questions about, you know, furthering the story. Have you ever looked at any of the books you've written and said, now I'm gonna write the nonfiction?
No. That's really hard work. I mean, novels have the great advantage that, you know, people talk to each other, but I'm making them talk. So it's easier from that point of view. Anything else, or have we had enough?
Joe, what's next?
What's next? Here's the thing, I never say exactly what the subject is because I'm always afraid that somebody will say, oh, that's interesting. And just, you get a dying fall and you go, oh, no, it's not gonna work. But there will be another one. Yes.
Do you have a favorite among your books?
Do you know what? You always like the one you just wrote. Seriously, I mean, because you hope or you think you're getting better. And I've learned not to go back and look at them because you can go, oh God, I wish I could rewrite that, etc. But you would like to think that you're learning as you go along, and that it's better. But if it weren't for that, probably I would say The Good German, because it was a kind of turning point in the career. I thought it seriously.
How are sales of Shanghai in Shanghai?
None. Of course, the English version would, you could do it. You know what? I don't know. I'm going to find out what the experts say. But Chinese rights are still available. Translation. Okay, thanks again for coming.